Within the walls of prison, where hardened criminals face the harsh reality of confinement, members of the Ku Klux Klan often find themselves outnumbered, walking around with a huge target on their backs.
The former Ku Klux Klan leader was 80 years old. The man convicted in the 1964 slaying convicted him of 3 counts of manslaughter.
These aren't just ordinary inmates, but convicts of hate crimes, race-motivated attacks, and violent acts towards minorities. What is the fate of these extremists and white supremacists once the prison doors slam shut? Join us as we explore what happens to KKK members in prison. Dylann Roof. August 4th, 2016. Dylann Roof, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, was out of his cell and on the way to the shower when he was attacked and beaten by a black inmate in a South Carolina jail. Roof, who was standing trial for the murder of 9 African Americans in a church when the attack took place at the Charleston County Detention Center, was an active member of the KKK, famed for his violent and hate-fueled rampage. While he was securely kept in protective custody, the 22-year-old was exposed in a moment of vulnerability, after the only guard present left to fetch toilet tissue for another inmate. Seeing the open window of opportunity, another inmate named Dwayne Stafford ran down the stairs from his cell in the protective custody unit and attacked Roof with his fists, leaving him with bruises around the face and the back. But since no weapons were used in the attacks, Roof wasn't seriously injured and was simply treated and returned to his cell. But even though Stafford offered no explanations for his actions, the appalling nature of Roof's crime made him a huge target for other inmates, who wanted so desperately to even the scores. It all began on the evening of June 17, 2015, when Roof launched a deadly attack on the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, located in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. As a Bible study was going on in the church, Roof opened fire with his handgun, brutally ending the lives of 9 people in one of the deadliest racially motivated crimes ever recorded in the city. But before he picked up the gun and started shooting, the outspoken white supremacist had shown several indications that his ideologies would soon take a violent turn. According to the testimonies of a childhood friend, Roof went on a rant about the killing of Trayvon Martin, as well as the 2015 Baltimore protest that was sparked by the death of Freddie Gray while he was in jail. He also constantly talked about how blacks were taking over the world, even reportedly informing his friends and neighbors about his plan to kill people. However, his plan to attack the College of Charleston was not taken seriously. In one of his posts on Facebook, Roof could be seen wearing a jacket decorated with 2 obsolete flags, used as emblems among several American white supremacist movements. According to his former roommate, Roof often expressed support for racial segregation in the United States. With a plan to start a civil war, however, after analyzing the security at the college, he decided that the church would be an easier target. In his testimony, Roof would later reveal that he almost didn't go through with the shooting because the church study group had been so nice to him. But despite the reception he got, Roof brought out his handgun and murdered 9 of the people present before he was arrested by the officers. It was during the pre-sentencing process that he got attacked in jail, and surprisingly, he decided not to press charges against the black inmate responsible for the assault. Following a 2017 trial that was heavily monitored by the media, the young KKK member was sentenced to death, becoming the first person in the United States to receive capital punishment for a federal hate crime. Frazier Glenn Miller Jr. April 13, 2013, a KKK pioneer identified as Frazier Glenn Miller Jr. was arrested following a shooting in Overland Park, Kansas, and charged with capital murder. As one of the main figures of the Ku Klux Klan movement back in the early days, Miller became one of the few members to be sentenced to death for their hate crimes. Born on November 23, 1940 in North Carolina, Miller grew up in one of the darkest eras of race inequality in America. After dropping out of high school, he joined the United States Army, served for 20 years, and rose to the rank of Master Sergeant in the Special Forces. His introduction to white nationalism began when his father handed him a copy of the Thunderbolt, a newspaper published by Edward Reed Fields, a member of the National States Rights Party. This marked the beginning of his journey into the world of hate crimes, propagation of hate ideologies, and enactment of violence against other races. It was this same ideology that would eventually lead to his disgraceful exit from the United States Army later in 1979, after he was caught distributing racist propaganda. In the following year, 1980, Miller founded the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, a local chapter which would eventually grow to become the White Patriot Party. As the leader and principal spokesman for the organization, Miller organized rallies, spearheaded the recruitment of new members, and further spread the racist and polarizing message of the KKK with intense passion. Back in the day, the WPP was a pro-apartheid community, which unapologetically promoted Christian identity theology and openly advocated for the establishment of an all-white nation in the territory of the American South. In an attempt to spread his delirious message even further, Miller sought the seat of power by contesting for governor of North Carolina under the Democratic Party in 1984, but was never able to secure a nomination. Then in 1986, he tried clinching a seat in the United States under the Republican Party, but was also denied a nomination after placing last in the Republican primaries. But Miller's ideology wasn't just all talk. He took many critical steps to ensure his message was spread far and wide, including operating what could be deemed as a paramilitary camp and taking up arms against the Jews and African Americans he had a special hatred for. After his secret armed force was discovered, Miller was arrested and charged with criminal contempt of court, receiving a 1-year sentence. However, he would only spend 6 months in prison before he was eventually released, under the condition that he would have no further contact with white supremacists. On April 6, 1987, Miller signed and forwarded a typewritten letter titled Declaration of War to 5,000 recipients. In this disturbing letter, the KKK leader stated that he was starting a war on African Americans, Jews, white race traitors, crossbreeders, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. The plan was to assassinate a host of federal officers and other targets in what he described as holy vengeance and justice. On April 30, 1987, a massive raid was launched on his mobile home in Ozark, Missouri, where officers found a cache of weapons enough to equip a small army. This included C4 plastic explosives, dynamite, pipe bombs, hand grenades, shotguns, pistols, crossbows, military-grade weapons, and around half a ton of ammunition. He was later indicted for communicating a threat via United States mail in 1987 and pleaded guilty to avoid all the other federal charges against him. Despite posing a threat to national security, Miller was only sentenced to 5 years in prison for engaging in paramilitary activity and weapons violation. Even worse, he only served 3 years before he was released. For the next few years after his release, Miller released an autobiography, which he continued his advocacy for a white Christian state, published a white nationalist newsletter, and continued to incite Americans to rise against Jews, people of color, immigrants, abortion rights activists, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. But as he grew older, his influence began to wane, and despite running for political offices over and over, he was never able to secure a victory. On April 13, 2014, Miller made news again after a shooting was reported in suburban Kansas City, resulting in the death of 3 people. The attack, which took place outside the Jewish Community Center and outside a retirement home located in Overland Park, shocked the entire community. But in an unexpected twist, it would later turn out that all 3 victims were actually Christians. Miller also shot at several other victims, including a Jewish person, who escaped without any injuries. He was later found outside an elementary school and arrested. While he was locked behind a police vehicle, Miller kept shouting Nazi slogans, and according to his later testimony, he'd planned and carried out the attack because he knew he was getting old and wanted to end the lives of some Jews before he died. During his trial, Miller decided to represent himself, ranting and raising absurd objections at every turn and attempting to justify his actions. But his defense crumbled like a pack of cards, and on August 31, 2015, Miller was found guilty of 1 count of capital murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and assault and weapons charges. On September 8, a Kansas jury recommended the death penalty, which was later imposed on November 10, 2015. During his time on death row, Miller became a menace in prison, hurling insults and threats at corrections officers, especially those of minority races. On May 3, 2021, Miller took his last breath in prison while waiting for his execution. He was 80 and never apologized to any of his victims until his death. Tom Terrence. The story of KKK member Tom Terrence is a redemption tale contrary to the path chosen by the other convicts in this episode. Terrence, born in the early 60s, grew up at a time when America experienced a total political, social, and cultural reset. Growing up in Alabama, in a period when federally mandated desegregation of public schools was in full swing, Terrence watched Governor George Wallace take a stand against the policy, uttering his infamous pledge of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. This sentiment, fortunately, didn't age well, but at the time, many white citizens of Alabama became fearful and angry as the archaic system they'd grown accustomed to was being torn apart right before their very eyes. This ignited a wave of racism across the South, as young Alabamians like Terrence became indoctrinated and infused with hatred towards minority groups. According to the former KKK member, his high school became one of the first to bow to the desegregation policy and allow black students in, fueling his hate even more. He began consuming white supremacist, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic propaganda being circulated within his high school. It was also during this same period that he met certain advocates who convinced him that black people were inferior to whites and that by enabling intermarriage, the white race was being weakened. He began to see people of other races as enemies of the state, and as he watched them succeed and climb the social ladder, he became more and more enraged. His hatred would eventually find expression when he joined the Mississippi chapter of the White Knights, an arm of the Ku Klux Klan, which armed him and gave him the outlet to release pent-up aggression through violence. One of his most notable missions involved the bombing of the Beth Israel Synagogue located on Old Canton Road in Jackson, Mississippi. Around 10:40 p.m. on Monday, September 18, 1967, a bomb exploded at the facility, destroying the administrative offices and causing over $200,000 worth of damages. Investigations would later reveal that half a case of dynamite was placed against a recessed outside door and detonated, but thankfully, no one was present in the building at the time. While the nation was still reeling from the effects of the bombing, Terrence embarked on another deadly mission on May 28, 1968, when he, alongside another White Knights hitman named Danny Joe Hawkins, planted explosives at the Beth Israel congregation located 90 miles away in Meridian, Mississippi's Queen City. In the end, the bombing caused about $400,000 in damages, but once again, no one was injured. However, it was this bombing that finally confirmed Terrence's involvement in the incessant attacks, leading officers to set a trap to catch him. As part of an elaborate plan, the local Jewish community raised funds to pay 2 KKK members for intelligence about the Klan's bombing plans. After learning that Terrence was planning an attack on the home of Jewish leader Meyer Davidson on June 30, 1968, the FBI and the Meridian police hatched a plan to ambush and catch him in the act. As soon as Terrence and Danny Joe Hawkins arrived on the scene, a car chase ensued between Terrence and the officers, and as he fired his machine gun at officers, they fired back and hit him with 4 blasts of shotgun. As for his accomplices, Danny Joe Hawkins and Kathy Ainsworth, they both lost their lives during the exchange of gunfire. Terrence would eventually be convicted and sentenced to serve 30 years in prison following a 2-day trial. However, after spending just 6 months in the Mississippi State Penitentiary, the young extremist escaped from the facility with 2 other inmates, intending to return to his terrorist ways. The joyride only lasted a couple of days before all 3 inmates were cornered by officers who engaged them in a fierce gun battle, leading to the death of one of them. Upon his return to prison, Terrence was confined to a 6-by-9-foot cell within the maximum security unit, gaining an extra 5 years to his sentence. He was kept alone for the most part, and apart from his twice-weekly showers, had no human contacts. It was during this time that he began studying classical philosophy before switching over to the Bible out of curiosity. It didn't take long for his wicked ways to start unfolding before his eyes, and he made the decision to change his ways and spread a more positive message. He renounced his allegiance to the Klan, and after serving his sentence, became a Christian minister, teaching the world to move on from hateful ideologies and embrace love and unity. While Terrence was able to find redemption within the walls of the prison, the same cannot be said for the next KKK member. Before we go on with the rest of the video, here's our subscribers' pick for today. As we explore what happens to KKK members in prison, the story of Larry Webster stands as a poignant example of how even the prison cell isn't safe for criminals convicted of hate crimes. Webster, who was arrested in November 1993 on charges of kidnapping and robbery, became the subject of a targeted attack after landing in a Texas prison. As a known member of the KKK, Webster was placed in the same cell with several black prisoners, a move that many have considered an intentional attempt to expose him to serious danger. Due to the overcrowding in the prison, they couldn't segregate him, and thanks to his tattoos, he was easily identifiable by these inmates, who singled him out due to his criminal history. One day, while the guards weren't watching, Webster was attacked, brutally beaten, kicked in the face, and even suffered an elbow injury. His wounds were so severe that he required treatment in a hospital emergency room. However, Webster would later sue the correctional facility for purposefully setting him up, representing himself in the case, and winning a total payout of $55,000. Do you think Webster's case was justified? Share your thoughts with us in the comments down below. Now let's get back to the video. Edgar Ray Killan. Imagine being thrown in prison to serve 60 years for murder, getting out months later on a technicality, and then getting sent back to prison on the same technicality. This is the story of Edgar Ray Killan, a Mississippi-born KKK hitman who carried out the infamous Freedom Summer murders back in 1964. Before turning over to the path of criminality, Killan worked as a sawmill operator and a part-time Baptist minister, but would later join the KKK and become a Kleagle, or recruiter for the group, while also organizing hate campaigns for the Neshoba and Lauderdale County chapters. In the summer of 1964, during a time when activists were fighting for voting rights for minority groups, known as Freedom Summer, 3 men lost their lives at the hands of KKK members in Philadelphia, Mississippi. 21-year-old James Chaney, a black man from Meridian, Mississippi, 20-year-old Andrew Goodman, and 24-year-old Michael Schwerner, 2 Jewish men from New York, championed this voting rights movement. But on this fateful day, Edgar Killan and the deputy sheriff of Neshoba County, Cecil Prince, assembled a group of armed men to attack and kill these 3 civil rights workers. The attack, which was ordered by Samuel Bowers, the Grand Wizard of the local White Knights of the KKK, took the whole community by shock. However, at the time, the state of Mississippi made no efforts to prosecute any of the guilty parties, despite their identities being known. It took the brave efforts of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and the FBI under President Lyndon B. Johnson to finally open a vigorous investigation into the incident. Despite dismissals by federal judges, a federal prosecutor named John Doerr convened a grand jury to determine the direction of the case in December 1964. This would eventually lead to the arrest and prosecution of 18 men, including Killan, who were all charged with conspiracy to violate the civil rights of the victims. The trial began in 1966 at the federal courthouse of Meridian, as the accused stood before an all-white jury. However, the case would later end with the conviction of 7 conspirators, including the deputy sheriff, while the remaining 8 were acquitted. This was the first time in history when a white jury would convict a white official of murdering a civil rights activist. But then, here's where things took a very dark turn. As the jury deliberated on Killan's case, they couldn't reach a verdict, and the trial ended in a hung jury. While 11 of the 12 jurors voted for a conviction, the lone holdout claimed she could not convict a preacher, and since the prosecution wasn't willing to retry Killan, he was released a free man. As for the remaining 6 men, none of them would eventually serve more than 6 years in prison before they got released. Over 2 decades later, award-winning investigative reporter Jerry Mitchell brought new life to the case, writing about it for 6 years and seeking justice for the victims of the attack. Finally, in early January 2004, a multiracial group of citizens in Neshoba County formed the Philadelphia Coalition to seek justice for the 1964 murders. The group, led by Leroy Clemens and Jim Prince, met on several occasions to initiate a new trial for Killan, who was still walking free up until that moment. That changed on January 6, 2005, when a local grand jury finally indicted him for the murders. Now at 80 years old, Killan began his heavily anticipated trial on June 13, 2005 in a wheelchair after breaking his leg a few months prior. On June 21, 2005, 41 years after the crime was committed, he was found guilty of manslaughter. He was subsequently sentenced to 60 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. However, that's not where the story ends. Because on August 12, 2005, after spending less than 2 months in prison, Killan was released on a $600,000 bond after claiming that he could not use his right hand and had placed his left hand on the Bible during his swearing-in. After the judge determined he wasn't a flight risk nor a danger to the community, he allowed him to go home. But the story took an even wilder turn on September 3rd, when a newspaper report revealed that Killan, who initially claimed to have been confined to the wheelchair, was seen walking and driving around with no problem. A hearing was immediately scheduled for September 9th, where several officers confirmed the report, with one even revealing how Killan shook hands with him using his right hand. His bond was immediately revoked, and he was sentenced back to prison for committing fraud against the court. While he continued demanding a new trial, all attempts were denied. Between August 2010 and November 2011, Killan shared a prison cell with a black preacher named James Hart Stern, and the two gradually forged a close relationship. It was during this period that Killan began to admit the depravity that had embellished his soul and clouded his judgment. After leaving prison, Stern maintained communication with Killan, and the two shared many letters where Killan outlined his views on race and confessed to his many crimes. To crown his restitution process, Killan signed over his land in Mississippi to Stern and gave him power of attorney. On January 5, 2016, Stern invoked this power of attorney to finally dissolve Killan's branch of the KKK. As for Killan himself, he would eventually die on prison January 11, 2018. He was 92. James Ford Seal. Remember how Tom Terrence, the KKK hitman who became a preacher following his release from prison? Well, he wasn't the only notorious Klan member who was active in Mississippi at the time. Meet James Ford Seal, a white supremacist who aggressively promoted racist ideologies from the 60s but escaped justice for many decades, until his eventual conviction in 2007. His conviction, like a roller coaster, was overturned the following year, and then reinstated the year leading to an eventual sentence of triple life imprisonment. Born on June 25, 1935, James Seal was a Ku Klux Klan member charged for the May 1964 kidnappings and murder of Henry Hezekiah D. and Charles Eddie Moore, two African-American young men in Meadville, Mississippi. Seal, who had previously worked as a police officer in Louisiana back in the 70s, was an active member of the militant Klan organization, known as the Silver Dollar Group. This special group within the KKK was composed of members who were identified with the silver dollar, often minted in the year of their birth. Growing up in southern Mississippi, Seal watched the civil rights movement blossom on the 1960s, as many working-class whites cowered in the unfounded fear of greater job competition following the integration of blacks in the labor market. This further fueled the proliferation of the Ku Klux Klan movement in the area, with strings of violence targeted at black-owned businesses, churches, and other infrastructure. Seal became a central figure in this movement during the period, and he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. The crime that etched his name in the book of history took place on May 2, 1964, when he abducted two black men, Henry Hezekiah D. and Charles Eddie Moore. both 19 years old. According to the FBI, Seal had initially thought the two men were civil rights activists, and so after presenting himself as a federal revenue agent investigating moonshine stills, he ordered them to get into his car. He then put a call through to Charles Marcus Edwards, asking him and other Klansmen to follow as he drove the two men into the Homachito National Forest. Upon arriving in the secluded area, Seal pulled out a sawed-off shotgun and ordered Dee and Moore out of the car before tying them to a tree. For the next grueling couple of hours, both men were beaten with long bean sticks before they were then taken to a nearby farm, alive but bloodied. Seal then duct-taped their mouths and hands, wrapped them in a plastic tarp, and placed them into the truck of another Klansman named Ernest Parker. From here on, they were driven 100 miles to the Old River near Tallulah, Louisiana, where Seal then tied them to an old Jeep engine block and dumped them in the water to drown. 2 months later, the bodies of Dee and Moore were discovered by U.S. Navy divers looking for 3 other missing civil rights workers, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney. An investigation was immediately launched, leading to the arrest of the then 29-year-old Seal, along with fellow Klansman Charles Marcus Edwards, who was 31. According to an informant working with the FBI, both men confessed to the crime, but were released 5 days later after their family members posted a bond of $5,000 each. The case would eventually become muddled with complications for decades until January 24, 2007, when an indictment affidavit was filed in the U.S. District Court in Jackson, charging Seal with 2 counts of kidnapping and 1 count of kidnapping. Seal was immediately arraigned and denied bond since he was considered a flight risk. On June 14, 2007, the Klansman was convicted of kidnapping of conspiracy by a federal jury and then sentenced over a month later to serve 3 life terms for his crimes. His conviction was later overturned on September 9, 2008 by the Court of Appeals, then reinstated on June 5, 2009, after the en banc panel of the Fifth Circuit judges ruled in favor of the initial conviction. Seal's 3 convictions were reinstated, and all attempts to review the case were met with dismissal. Decades after committing the heinous crime, Seal was sent to the FCI Terre Haute, where he would later die on August 2, 2011. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.